Harriet Araminta Ross was born around 1821, but since nobody really considered it important to record the slave's date of birth and her parents couldn't write, the date isn't confirmed. But she was born in Maryland to two slaves, Old Rip and Ben. Her early childhood probably consisted of running around with her siblings, cousins, and other children, all barefoot. Later, she likely picked cotton or helped the other workers. When Minty was 6 or 7, however, her master, Mr. Brodus, hired her out to work for a new master, the Cooks. Mrs. Cook was a weaver. She had Minty help her wind yarn. The air was dusty, and if Minty coughed or lost her concentration, she would be whipped. Eventually, the cook set her set and watched rat traps. One day she felt sick, but was sent out to work anyways, and ended up being sent home to her parents for 6 weeks. Next, Mr. Brodus had her hired out to a woman, and at 7, she had to watch the baby. If the baby cried, she was whipped. Then, after the owners were fed up with her, she was sent back to Mr. Brodus, who had her work in the fields. Then she started to hear about people running away to the north, where they would be free. One day in 1834, Mr. Brodus's slaves and slaves from another plantation gathered. One man began moving across the field. The overseer noticed and followed, and so did Minty. The slave ran into a store. Both ran behind. The overseer followed him in and cornered the slave. The slave ran for the door, and when the overseer followed, Minty blocked him. The slave got away, but Minty got a 2-pound weight slammed into her face. For the rest of her life, she experienced dizzy spells, and no one thought she would survive. She ended up with a nasty scar, but earned people's respect. She would no longer go by the childhood name Minty. She was now Harriet Ross. Sometime later, Mr. Brodus died. Harriet got a new owner, Dr. Thompson. Although being more fair, he still hired Harriet out to John Stewart. For a while, Harriet did housework and chores, but asked if she could work outside, and her wish was granted. Her father taught her about the woods and what she would need to get away from slavery. Sometime later, Harriet loved and married John Tubman, someone who had been born free, despite his parents being slaves. Harriet made a quilt to represent her marriage from all sorts of different scraps of fabric, and begged John to escape with her, but he was perfectly content with the life he had with Harriet. However, Harriet was afraid that the master would hire her out, and she would have to move away. In the north, they would both be free. One day, Harriet worked close to the road and came across a Quaker. The Quaker woman and Harriet began to chat whenever they got the chance. She told Harriet that if she needed help, she could ask the woman. News came along that Harriet and some of her family were going to be sold. She made a plan with her brothers, and they tried to escape, but her brothers were too loud. She was forced to escape by herself a few nights later. Harriet stayed with the Quaker woman for a while and gave her the wedding quilt as a gift. She got directions from the woman and became a passenger on the Underground Railroad. There were no trains or roads on the Underground Railroad, as it was a series of stops that were homes or stores of Quakers and abolitionists. Harriet was now a passenger. Her journey ended in Pennsylvania, a free state. However, freedom was not easy. There was no one to welcome her, and her family and friends were still slaves. She would have to go back to get them. Harriet took up work in a hotel, and although it was easy and she got money for it, she didn't like it. However, there wasn't anyone to make her stay. Harriet learned that her sister and her family were going to be sold, and so she decided to go and bring them to the north. With a lot of help, Harriet made a plan. It was almost too late by the time they got it, but they hadn't been sold yet. The family managed to get to Harriet using a series of tricks and codes, and in the end, they were free too. Since she was going to be guiding many other slaves north, Harriet bought a gun with the money she earned. However, in 1850, the Fugitive Slave Law was passed, meaning that slaves had to be given back to their masters. Now Harriet would have to bring her parcels across the border to Canada. It was a longer trip and would be more dangerous. After freeing other slaves, Harriet went to free John. However, she found that he already had another wife and wouldn't go with. So instead she took a group of others who wanted to be freed. From now on, Harriet will be traveling mostly with complete strangers, unlike before when she went with a family member or friend. Harriet began a routine. She became familiar with the Quakers and hiding spots, while never traveling the same route twice. She developed tricks for escaping. Men dressed like women dressed like men, escaping on a Saturday night, since Sunday was their day off. Harriet was being hunted herself. There were rumors about her. Of course, they were all ridiculous, but it increased her reputation, and owners knew about her too. They offered high rewards for her capture and accurate descriptions. Her scar didn't help either. Despite all this, Harriet continued. She had to save her parents, who were growing old and frail. They could not walk all night or run through the woods. Harriet had them ride on a wagon and found them a house in New York. Now part of her income would go to her parents. She had to work many jobs to keep up with the bills. She would speak at anti-slavery meetings for extra money. This was part of how she spread her name. It became very dangerous for her to be a conductor on the Underground Railroad. Her last journey brought a small family up north. Harriet wanted to work for freedom, so now she just needed to find a way to. In 1861, a civil war broke out between the northern and southern states. While the southern states wanted slavery to be legal everywhere in America, the North did not. This caused the South to secede and form an army called the Confederate States of America. The North then called itself the Union States of America. John Andrew invited Harriet, who of course wanted to help the Union cause. In the army, there were lots of slaves who wanted to fight for their freedom. However, they still thought like slaves and expected the white soldiers to give them orders. Harriet had to teach them to think and act like free men. She also had black women. She taught them about how they could make a living as free people. Harriet also became a nurse. Many of the slaves had been wounded, and so Harriet helped them. She used one of her mother's brews at the time to treat dysentery, a disease that caused horrible stomach cramps and usually death at the time. The war dragged on. For a while, it seemed the South would win. Thousands were wounded or killed. In 1863, however, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and slaves from the South became free to join the Union cause. Harriet was then asked if she could become a scout for the black troops. It was kind of like being asked to be a spy. The white men, although at first being unsure about Harriet, quickly came to respect and admire her. Harriet was used to danger, so being a spy was perfect for her. She used her knowledge to lead an attack. The aim was to take out train tracks that led the supplies to the southern troops. During the mission, they also destroyed other supplies in the camp and recruited 760 slaves. She continued to lead troops into enemy territory. Soon Harriet returned home to her parents. The government still owed her. After resting for a while, Harriet returned to work, but she never got it. She went and worked at Forest Monroe Hospital in Washington, D.C. She cared for black patients and was soon promoted to head nurse. Then the war ended. Slavery was abolished throughout the entire United States. Harriet opened a place for slaves to stay. She made friends with another woman who wrote and published books about Harriet and her life. She also married Nelson Davis, who gave her another chance at having a family. The money Nelson earned helped to support the people in Harriet's care. However, Nelson died, and so Harriet had to support the people in her care alone. She went door to door selling vegetables. Sometimes she was invited inside, and she would tell stories about the war or her life. She gave speeches for extra money, too. However, she had to turn her house over to a church, and they tried to make a profit out of it. Then, at the age of 92, Harriet caught pneumonia and passed away. Just some final thoughts on this. I think that I could have done some better voice acting. I'm not very good at voice acting, so please don't judge me or anything. And also, subscribe and like. I'll leave sources and helpful references in the description below. Thank you for watching.